My guest today is none other than Bill Mulligan. And today we're going to talk about a very specific topic. So why don't you introduce what we're going to talk about today?
Well, for the last 20 some years, I've been researching Irish immigrant copper miners in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And this has led me to investigate the history of copper mining in Ireland, to figure out how they acquired the skill, when they left, when they did, and then to follow them through, since in many ways it's a history of failure, because the community, while large and somewhat successful, ultimately falls victim to prejudice, and after about the 1870s begins to drift away from Upper Michigan and
People
go
that
to
never
settling
really
up.
people never really looked highly on the Irish either, have they?
No, what happens is, initially when the mines first open, it's in the wilderness. It's at the western end of Lake Superior. And it's very isolated part of the world. The lake freezes over for 6 months of the year, and so there's no ship access. And the railroad didn't come until the 1880s. So in the 1840s and 50s, this was a very isolated place.
Can't
And if you
imagine.
showed up there and knew how to actually mine, which meant going underground and drilling by holding a metal drill over your head while someone hit it with a sledgehammer by candlelight and then setting off explosives, you could find work.
Right.
And they didn't ask a lot of questions. And there's Irish, there's Germans, and there's Cornish, all there. They don't get along very well. And I found out, in fact, in the company records, all of the crews are one ethnic group. Each ethnic group has their own crews. The Cornish don't work with the Irish. They don't work with the Germans. They all work separately. And this actually has some follow through things that I found later that maybe we can talk about in terms of language. But as the mines go deeper, they require more capital, and capital is something that comes from the East Coast. And in this instance, it mostly comes from Boston, which is controlled by old line Yankee Protestants. And they are very anti-Irish. They think the Irish are troublesome because they want more money and various other things. In fact, in 1862, they sent agents to Sweden to recruit miners to come to Upper Michigan to replace the Irish.
Right.
But the Irish somehow found out about this, and due to the vagaries of Great Lakes shipping, which won't take a lot of time to explain, they had to change ships to get into the harbor near the copper mines. It didn't have sufficiently deep draft for the big lake ships. Well, the miners arranged for Union Army. This is during the American Civil War, and Union Army recruiters met the boat and offered the Swedes $300 to join the Union Army. And most of them did. They took the money and joined the army. And in the annual report, it's in the Quincy Mining Company's annual report for 1863, and it somewhat laconically says, the experiment of recruiting miners in Europe will not be repeated again this year.
So
and so they were able to turn back that attack. But in 1878, the head of the mining company in Boston wrote to the manager and said, the Knights of Labor are troublesome. They're mostly Irish. It would be best not to increase that nationality. And I'm able to match that up with a lack of promotion, increasingly Irish not being hired, and it's a one industry location, and so people have to think to leave. And as it turns out, at around that time, a man named Marcus Daly, who is from Ireland, wins the Battle of the Copper Kings in Butte, Montana. And he welcomes the Irish. And so there's this exodus, if you will, to Butte, where they can go and get good jobs as miners. They are not going to be discriminated against. They can have promotions. Daley builds 5 Catholic churches. He writes directly to the Archbishop of Dublin for priests and nuns to start schools. And so what you see, and this is kind of sort of micro history, I guess, in this, the local newspaper had a social page. And at first I didn't think much of the social page, but I began looking at it just you try to be complete. And there were notices. Patrick Riley came back from Butte to bury his father. His mother will be going home with him. John Flynn came from, and you see this whole succession of people coming back to bury a parent from where they had gone to find work. And so I was able to reconstruct the patterns of these migration, particularly to Butte. Butte was the main destination, but many also went to Leadville, Colorado. And interestingly, one group tried to return to be farmers or tried to be farmers. And, I don't know how much your listeners know about Irish American history, but right after the Civil War here, a group of Union Army veterans invaded Canada.
Was this Canadian American War you're referring to?
Well, it's not really the United States government is not involved in it.
This is not the main American Canadian War, in 18.
No, it's not the War of 18. No, this is in 1866, 1867, after the American Civil War, and it was quite unsuccessful. But one of the leaders of that, when he got out of prison, and the U.S. government put him in prison for this, he recruited about 15 families from the copper mining district to go to north central Nebraska to establish farms. And I actually spent a week there researching those families and their attempts to sort of establish a viable community in a fairly inhospitable environment. I mean, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan has a very, very long, hard winter, but where they were is one of those areas where there's not very reliable rainfall, which makes it very difficult, as everyone would know, to maintain any kind of farm. But I was able to find a lot about that community, and that fed into one of the things that I began to question about the general narrative about Irish immigration to the United States. One of the things people often say is one of the advantages the Irish had was that they had English when they arrived. Well, it turns out that that's not really true. I found a number of instances where the Irish in the copper country were Irish speakers and monoglot Irish speakers. And so that they did not have English. And that helps explain in part why they didn't integrate better into the larger community. Partly it's because the housing patterns of the mines tend to be dispersed around the mine openings, but also if you don't, if you have a different language from everyone else, it's going to be a more tightly clustered community. In fact, I found that upwards of around 90% through 1900 marry another Irish person. They don't marry outside their group to any appreciable degree. So
but I would ask you before we go into the story, how did you get this interest in this specific topic, like the Irish mining community? Well, how did you come across this?
Well, in 1993, I was living in the mining district. And I lived on Healy Avenue, and on the business buildings, there were Irish names, carved into the top of the building, and street names, and early county and city officials were Irish, but I never met any Irish people. And I began, people, Mulligan is a fairly easy name to spell, but
it sounds very Irish.
Well, it is, but most of the people there are Finns and Italians, and so I was called Moylanen a few times, And so I began investigating, well, how could people be so prominent, that their names, a group, that their names are on streets and on business blocks, but they disappeared. And so I started with that premise of trying to track down, what had gone wrong essentially, and why had this group reached a certain point and then had to leave. And it never had occurred to me that they would be miners in Ireland, because everything I read said that there was no mineral wealth in Ireland.
Right.
So I was kind of, because on miner, you don't just send anyone underground with high explosives. You want people who know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And so they had to have some. So I actually went to Ireland, to Cork, and gave a paper at a conference. And I sort of raised that question, that I was curious. And one of the Irish historians in the audience said, well, they were probably from the copper mines at Allihies. And I said, well, what copper mines at Allihies? Everything I read says, there were no mineral resources in Ireland except for peat. And he said, yes, it says that, but it's really wrong. And there actually is a fairly extensive mining history in Ireland. And even today is no copper, but there are still some operating mines, particularly nickel. And so I came back a couple of years later and went out to Allihies and was able to get microfilm of a lot of the mining company records and began matching up people's names. And I went to some of the old cemeteries in the Copper District, and quite often they would list where the person had been born. And quite a number of them were born in the Castletown, Bearhaven, Allihies area. And, so I was able to establish that connection. And I met with the local historians and genealogists, and they were vaguely aware of it, but it coincides with the famine. And so communication was not as good as later immigrants or even earlier immigrants, because there's such a disruption in Ireland. And it's compounded by several things. I don't know, get into too much detail, but it's also one of the few areas where Irish immigrants went where they didn't control the Catholic Church. Right. There were very few Irish priests in the area ever. When they first got there, most of the priests were Slovenian. They were missionaries to the Native Americans, and they spoke German, French, the native language, Anishinaabe, and a whole variety of European languages. But they had very little English, if they had any. And so the Irish arrive, and unlike when they get to New York or Boston or East Coast cities, the church is largely an Irish institution. Here, the church was a somewhat, I wouldn't say hostile, but it wasn't as welcoming as it might have been, because those people were there to minister to the Native Americans. And they were a little bit concerned about this influx of settlers and miners. Mining communities can be a little rowdy. And in fact, that was one of the things that gave me the first clue about the language, which was a surprise, because like everyone else, I assumed that they had arrived with English. But in the diary of the first bishop of the area, who's Frederick Barraga, he writes about his assistant who's in the copper country and what a heroic effort he's making to learn the Irish language, because many of his parishioners only speak Irish. And that sort of got my attention, because I wasn't expecting it, and it had to be a serious issue if the priest would go to the trouble of trying to teach himself Irish to communicate with his parishioners.
Right.
And so that led me to some other incidents that suggest that the language was alive there and spoken into the 1880s. The last case I found of a monoglot Irish speaker is from the 1880s. And he managed to work there and make a living in the mines without speaking a word of English
But
for a
I want
number
to
of years.
know, we touched briefly on this in the Gold Rush episode with Arizona Ghostwriters was here, but what was life like in the mines for an Irish worker? Was it good pay or was it like, how could
Well,
risk?
the pay was, the working conditions were hard. You worked underground for about 12 hours a shift. It's a 12-hour shift. The pay was not particularly good. That was one of their constant grievances, was overpay. The mines were quite profitable, but they didn't pay very well. You would walk to the mine in the 1850s. When you enter a mine and begin to go underground, when you get 100 feet underground, the temperature is a fairly constant 40 to 45 degrees year round. That's why bears hibernate in caves.
I imagine it would be cold, not hot.
Well, but for every 100 feet you go underground, the temperature rate increases about 1 degree. So by the time the mine gets to 1,000 feet, you're at 50 to 60 degrees. Well, the mines in the copper country got down to 6,000 feet. And the temperature at the bottom of the mine would be around 100 degrees. And you would work for 12 hours in 100-degree temperatures. And then they had what are called man cars, which were on tracks, and they would lower you down at an angle. At about 15 miles an hour, you would go down. Then you would come up from 100 degrees to the surface, and it would be at about 15 miles an hour. So you would be up in 15, 20 minutes. And in the winter, you would then have to walk a quarter of a mile to the building to change your clothes. And the temperature might be we use Fahrenheit here, but be about 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit.
Oh,
It'd be 30 degrees below 0. And you would have to walk a quarter of a mile. Having just been in 100 degrees, you're now at minus 40 degrees.
and I imagine
And
the
you
work
have to
from
walk.
dark to dark, right? They never see the sun.
Yeah, in fact, that's something I'm working on. I was supposed to give a paper in Greenland, of all places, on the role of darkness in their lives, but it was canceled because of the COVID. The days up there, it's far enough north. I don't know what country you're in.
Norway.
I should, but pardon?
Norway.
Well, it's far enough north that in the winter, the days it's dark by 4 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really get light until so you're familiar with. So if you're going to work in the mine from 7 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night, you go to work in the dark and you come home in the dark much of the year. Now in the summer it's different. It's a very long day.
Yeah, I mean it depends how close to the polar circle you are, right?
Yeah, it's well above. I should have looked it up, but it's well above the 45th. You can't grow tomatoes there. You can't grow corn there.
Obviously,
the main crops are hay and potatoes.
Right.
And I guess onion. You can grow onions, but it's a very hard life physically. Now and you're underground in this temperature. And the only light they have are from well into the 19th century. The only light they have are from candles.
Yeah.
And so you're in this very dark environment. I mean, even if you have a crew of 5 or 6 people, a few candles aren't going to give you much light. Plus, they were charged for the candles. The candles were deducted from their wages. So a lot of the accounts mentioned that they would only light 1 candle at a time to save on candles because they didn't want to have them docked out of their pay. And so you're working in the dark with holding a steel bar over your head that has a drill bit on the end. And 1 or 2 people will hit that with a 32-pound sledgehammer while you have to twist it slightly on each impact. And you do that until you drill a pattern of holes, and that's one of the skills that they have, is knowing, being able to read the face of the rock so that they know where to most efficiently place the drill holes. Then you pack those with blasting powder and a fuse, and then you go a distance away and hide behind something and set it off, and hope that it blows up. If it doesn't blow up, you have a very dangerous situation.
But what was the value of copper compared to, like, let's say, silver, gold, etc.?
It's not as well. It's initially its value it's much less valuable than gold or silver, but it's very plentiful, and so you can produce a large quantity of it, and over time, particularly now, this is after the Irish have moved on from Michigan, but over time it becomes increasingly valuable, particularly when the invention of electricity, because of, and it's especially valuable because one of the contaminants in the copper chemically in that area is silver. It has a higher, silver and copper appear together quite a bit, and the copper there has a slightly higher silver content than normal, which means it's more conductive for electricity, and so it actually makes better wire. So it attracted a very good price on the world market, well into the into at least the World War I period.
Now you mentioned that in the winter the lake froze over, but how did they ship out in the winter? Did they save it up until the summer?
They saved it up until the navigation would open. The navigation usually opened around April. In fact, you can in the newspaper, they would have a citywide, community-wide party to celebrate the end of navigation. It sounds like a little bit of a,
there were no ice road truckers back then, no.
Yeah, and they would have, they would celebrate, they were going in, and then in April when it was getting ready to reopen, they'd have another sort of going to have contact with the outside world, because until the railroad came in the 1880s, they didn't even get mail very often. The mail had to come by dog sled from about, from a significant distance away, from several hundred miles away. So it was very isolated place from October until April. But the work of the mines went on. There was a smelter there, so they smelted the copper in the region, and they would pile it up in warehouses near the docks, so that when the shipping opened up, they could ship it out quickly. But all of the things that you would need to survive in terms of food and things like that had to be stockpiled. There's a lot of curing of meats, canning, because you weren't getting shipments of any kind of food on foodstuffs on any regular basis. It was a very isolated place.
What was it like for the family that lived with the miners, that lived there?
Well, the families come fairly early. It's a little bit different than the California mines in that from the first.
Would you say it was more miserable in the copper mines than the California mines, or was it?
Oh, they're very different. It's a entirely different type of mining initially. These are underground mines where you go underground. The initial California mines are placer mines initially, where you literally filter sand and through in riverbanks and isolate the material. They don't go underground until somewhat later, whereas these mines from the very beginning are underground mines. And there was a California mine. Now, because the California mines take individuals don't have to, particularly at the beginning, there's not much necessity for any kind of real skill or capital, because you literally sort of have your claim and you have your you can process it with very, very limited tools. But eventually, of course, they do develop the underground mines, and they're very similar to what happens in Michigan. It's just a different lag time. The Michigan mines begin to open in 1844, 1845. California is 1849. So it's a few years, but the initial work in the two regions is quite different. Michigan is underground initially and rapidly becomes a high capital, high skill mining. California takes a little bit longer for that stage to be reached and to develop.
What's it like?
Plus, you can make more money very quickly with gold and silver if you hit it big. If you find a really good deposit, you can make a lot of money very quickly. Whereas with copper,
Takes time.
Takes time.
Well, was it like a small boom town when they came to with the company?
When they first came, yeah, it's initially there's nothing there, and so you have tents and cabins, but by 1850, within the first 5 or 6 years, there are towns that develop. There are some people come in to be merchants. There are stores. They have to build houses or log cabins. One of the things I have some nice pictures of log cabins that were built because you can't live in a tent in that environment,
especially very much
in the winter. So I mean, there's a sort of drive to do that, and because there are families, there is the demand for household goods. And in fact, one of the most successful of the Irish in the area is not a miner, but he has a dry goods store.
Right.
And he branches out from dry goods into groceries and various and other things. Is Edward Ryan. And when he died in 1900, he was worth just under $1 million US in 1900.
But what happened during the winter with the dry store? Since there were no other way of coming across?
Well, he would stock up.
Supply.
He would stock up. I mean, it's the fact that the navigation closes is not a surprise. So the plan was to stock up on goods, and you can if you look at the newspaper ads closely, as the winter wears on, the price of some things begins to creep up. But what he seems to have done was ordered in a large quantity of cloth, shoes, all the various things he was going to sell, and then sell off the inventory as the season unfolded. And then once the railroad comes, and he's still in business when the railroad comes, that changes it. Then it becomes more possible.
Again, I want to keep going with the winter because I find it fascinating when you're such an isolationist town. But this might be a stupid question, but there were another way to send the copper over? They couldn't load horses with supplies and go across the lake? Was that an option?
No, because it's just too far. I mean, because the lake, I mean, it's on Lake Superior, which is a huge, lake. Hauling it by horses through the snow, and in that area, they average about 300 inches of snow a year. I don't know what that is in centimeters, but the snow will be as high as a two-story, three-story building. The snow is impressive, and so the cost of something heavy like copper to be hauled by horses multiple days, which raises all kinds of problems with the horses in that kind of environment. How do you feed them? How do you keep them from freezing? No, they simply worked by stockpiling the goods that they had produced, the copper, and by bringing in large quantities of merchandise, ahead of time. And it was a sort of a cycle. I mean, that was something that you planned for and worked with. What little I've been able to find out about households, there's a great deal of canning and brining of meats and things. So the women are spending apparently a lot of time.
So, sorry, I just had to charge the computer. It's almost I just had to put it in plug. There you
No
go.
problem.
Yeah, so, I apologize for that.
Oh, no, that's no problem.
Yeah, I can carry on.
So, they quickly adjust to that as a rhythm of their life, and there's very little there's no mention in the newspapers or in any of the other sources that I've found of any periods of going without food or not being able. Some things, like cloth or a new pair of shoes might have been a little hard to get towards the end of the winter, but they seem to have planned well ahead in terms of providing themselves with plenty of food and social activities. The churches and community groups had lots of social activities in the winter, and they seem to have been very well attended. The Irish had a fraternal organization, Society of St. Patrick, by 1860, that had a hall, and they would bring in musical performers during the months when the place was accessible. They would have sort of community events during the winter. They had a lot of political speakers come in. They would have Irish, people who were advocating for Irish freedom from Britain would visit regularly. They took up collections to fund. I mentioned the invasion of Canada in the 1860s. They actually had fundraisers to help fund the invasion of Canada, which I found that was actually kind of a fascinating thing to find, because
right. Can you tell me a little bit about the invasion of Canada and why did they support the invasion of Canada?
Well, these are almost entirely Irish Catholics, and the resistance to British rule in Ireland is developing. And in the 1850s and 60s, you have.
So it was more or less personal. What do you say?
No, it's a political movement. In the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Ireland has branches in the United States, and they are organizing and raising money to eliminate British rule in Ireland. And they recruit. In fact, when Michael Corcoran recruited Irish immigrants in New York City to serve in the Union Army during the American Civil War in 1860, one of his arguments was, we will learn how to fight, we'll learn how to be soldiers, and we'll go home and we'll drive the British out of Ireland. They're very much linked into a sort of nationalist view of Ireland that wants to eliminate British rule.
The IRA,
it's a predecessor of the IRA. It's the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Fenians, and they're the Irish branch, the American branch of the same movement. And the idea is to take some part of Canada and occupy it and use it as a bargaining chip to get the British to give Ireland its independence.
Right.
And, it's probably, looking back, it's not a very rational plan, because there's a few thousand of these guys.
Right.
And
why should Britain care about a small area in Canada?
Well, and if they care, they have a fairly large army.
Yeah.
And your few thousand guys are probably not going to hold off the British army.
Yes.
But it's that kind of romantic nationalism, I think. When you read a lot of the literature on that, there's a sort of romantic nationalism and almost a desire.
You mentioned that there was, what was it, Latvian priests before?
Oh yeah, they were Slovenians. They were members of a missionary order.
What I want to know before the Swedes come, and I would like to ask you about that as well. So was there Was this a pure Irish community or was it mixed with?
Oh no, it's not a mixed. It's the announcement that there are copper reserves to be developed leads to an influx of people. Quite a few of them come from southwestern Wisconsin, northeastern Illinois, where there are lead mines.
Right.
And these include people who are Cornish, which is a traditional mining area where they mined copper and tin for many, many years. The Irish, who initially are from Tipperary, which is another story in terms of the timing of these things. The Tipperary mines were started early in Ireland and failed. And there's this migration in the 1820s and 30s and then there's also a significant number of Germans who seem to be fairly equally divided between Lutherans and Catholics. And then there are native-born Americans or people who had, just saw a business opportunity.
So how did these nationalities get along? Did they get along at all?
They didn't get along very well at all. There was a lot of competition because of the way the mines were organized. They worked on a contract system in which a team of 5 or 6 people would bid for jobs. So you would show up, say, on Monday morning, and they would say, well, we need someone to, run this tunnel 100 fathoms. How much will you do it for?
Right.
And you would sort of bid down the price. They would bid down the price, and so the teams, there's Cornish crews and German crews and Irish crews, and they're sort of bidding against one another, and so that's a source of tension. Then of course the Irish are Catholic, the Cornish are largely Methodist, so they don't interact. And in the 19th century, there's a lot of rivalries, at least in the United States, between different religious denominations as to can Catholics really be good Americans, or they're going to be too loyal to the Pope. And so there's already some anti-Catholic sentiment in the U.S. And of course, the Cornish, since they're Methodists and come speaking English, the Cornish language was pretty much extinct by then. The Germans are kind of in the middle, and they're the smallest group. But the Irish don't get along with them.
The Irish was the highest ranking group, if you will.
No, I would say the Cornish and the native-born Americans would have been the highest ranking group. Most of the early managers, there's a handful of Irish managers, but very quickly the Irish become the miners and foremen. But the actual superintendents, the people who run the mines, are almost always Cornish or Native American Protestants. But the Irish and the Germans don't get along because they even the German Catholics and the Irish Catholics don't quite agree on how the church should be set up.
Right.
They have different holidays they want to observe, different customs, and so there's tension there. No, there's a lot of ethnic tensions, and the mines manage it by keeping them as separate as they can, and that they work only with one another. The Cornish do better in terms of getting promotions than the Irish, but the Irish numerically come to be much more numerous. There aren't as many Cornish who come. The Irish are the largest group, but they're not necessarily the top group.
So you mentioned the Swedes before. So why was Swedes of all people? Why did they want to get Swedes over?
Well, I haven't been able to figure out how they chose Sweden, but one of the reasons was that they were Protestant. They wanted to have the Cornish were good workers. They were Protestant. I guess I probably should go study the history of mining in Sweden. But there may have been a crisis in the Swedish mining industry that freed people up. For example, one of the reasons why there's so many Irish and Cornish willing to migrate in the 1840s and 50s is the mining industries in Ireland and Cornwall are collapsing because copper is being produced in Chile and Australia in huge quantities and a very high quality. And when you look at the prices, most of the non-Michigan copper is chemically different from Irish copper and
Would you say the
Cornish
Swedes
copper.
were a cheap workforce, kind of like how
Well, they would have been a cheap workforce, and they would have been a Protestant workforce, and
kind of like how
they,
Polish people are today in Norway and Scandinavia, and they were cheap in America as well, the
well,
Swedes.
that may be. I suspect that that's part of it, and um, they later, and I suspect that this another part was that they didn't speak English,
Right.
and so they
It's
wouldn't.
not just svenska.
They couldn't team up. They couldn't sort of team up with the other workers, at least for a while.
Right.
They couldn't talk to the Cornish. They weren't going to bond with the Cornish because they had different languages. The
So it's more
Germans.
difficult to learn their rights, I suppose, and that kind of thing.
Well, I think it was more just because in the 1880s and 1890s they deliberately hire a broad mix of ethnic people, so to keep them from organizing, to try to keep them from organizing, because you have Italians and Poles and a lot of Finns, and they go to different churches. They have different languages, and the idea, I think, the mining company's idea was these guys won't form a union.
Right.
They can't communicate. They don't really
At least
like
not the
one
first
another.
generation.
Yeah, at least for the first generation. It's not a long-term plan, but um, the company seems to have played on ethnic rivalries, and I think the Swedes. Again, I confess I probably should find out what's going on in the Swedish mining industry. My hunch would be that there's
Yeah.
some kind of disruption that is caused because people usually. This is, I think, a generality about immigration history. People who are happy and comfortable rarely pick up and move halfway across the world.
Yeah.
Just for the heck of it. I mean, the Irish leave Ireland in part because of the potato famine drives people out. The mining industry is collapsing. Later, land, the families are too large for the land. People have to leave. Very few people are leaving France at this time.
I don't know if you know this, but a lot of Scandinavians there were quite a few Scandinavians that immigrated to America in the 1800s.
Oh yes, no.
Most of them were settled down in Minnesota, in the Minnesota area.
Well, this is not far from Minnesota. It's actually in Hancock, Michigan, which is the center of the copper district.
That's some of the areas where the Scandinavians settled down for some time.
No, in fact, there's a Finlandia University is in Hancock, and it goes back into the 19th century. It was originally a seminary for Finnish Lutheran ministers, and there's a lot of Danes and Norwegians and Swedes. All through Upper Michigan. In fact, the Finns are probably, even some of them were farmers. They would grow root crops and hay, and but they begin to come into the area as the Irish are leaving.
Right.
There's by the 1870s, the Irish are net moving out, and the last wave, when the Irish copper mines collapsed for good in the 1870s and finally literally closed down by 1880. Butte is the bigger destination because it's more welcoming. And to a lesser extent, Leadville. I have a friend who has done a very nice book manuscript on Leadville. And that becomes another destination. Michigan, by then it's well known it's not the best place to go if you're Irish. You're not going to be really welcome there. And whereas if you go to Butte, you'll be welcome, you'll be treated well, and you'll have opportunity to advance in the company.
But you mentioned the train coming in 1880s.
Yes.
Yeah. So how does the train, apart from the obvious reason, how does the train changes the community?
Well, the train can operate year round, and the train can move things more effectively from the mines, which, you have to put a mine where the mineral resource is. And so, well, among other things, that you can have a short line railroad that goes from the mines to the smelters, but the smelters are built right on an inlet of the lake. But in the iron mining district in Marquette, the first railroads are to connect the mines to the harbor. And so what that does is it makes the movement of raw material of the product to shipping more efficient. Then as the railroad branches out and gets to Green Bay and gets to places further south, you can begin to have communication with the outside world on a regular basis. You get the mail, on a regular basis year round.
So would this be the start
have
of the golden age, if you will, of the mining?
Well, actually, it's probably between the time the mines come and World War I is probably the peak of profitability. Yes, for the mines, not necessarily for the the Irish community or for the workers, but for the mining companies. As electrification moves forward, they're able to there's a tremendous demand for their product. They're able to ship it out more efficiently on a year-round basis. So that's a big plus. Plus, it's not as isolated. For the managers, I mean, they can get out. I mean, for example, a lot of the managers and the wealthier Irish and the Native Americans and the Cornish who had high-ranking positions, a lot of them sent their children to school in St. Louis because they could take the train. Eventually, they could take the train, and they could go down and go to St. Louis or go to university in Lower Michigan, and so they had much more opportunity to be in contact with the larger world for their families and you see more cultural events with the railroad. Then you don't have this long period where you really can't. You can bring in touring theatrical companies. They come in on the train, and you can have theatrical performances. You can have plays. You can have concerts. You can have things that break up the long winter with events at the there's fraternal halls. Each ethnic group has its social and fraternal organization. They have a hall. They organize events, cultural events, patriotic events, and they can do that when the railroad comes. They can do that year round, rather than only being able to do it for half of the year.
But how does World War I changes the industry? Does it change in the good way, or does it change for the worse?
Well, I don't think it changes the industry in a fundamental way. The production, the things that change the industry have a lot to do with electrification. When you have electric.
World War I does not have much effects on the.
Well, World War I is a sort of last prosperity. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question clearly.
How does World War I change the
World War? Well, it creates this tremendous demand for the product, for copper, and the price goes way up, and they're able to increase production that had been stabilizing because other markets were opening and their operating costs were high. Butte was very productive. Leadville was very productive. Mines were being developed in Arizona. You had the huge copper resources in Australia and Chile. And Michigan was kind of not the main game in town anymore. There were all these other younger districts. And the Michigan mines were very deep. By World War I, they're 5,000, 6,000 feet deep.
So you would say that it's starting to run out?
Well, they're starting to run out, but also they're just the operating costs. You have to pump out the water. The mines will, if you don't pump them out, they will fill with water. And so you have to be constantly pumping water from 6,000 feet deep. So you have that, and then your time to get people up and down. They actually had dock mules that lived in the mines underground and never came to the surface, that hauled the carts along little tracks within the mine to bring
That
them.
must be a depressing life.
Yes, for the poor mules. They literally had mule stalls at different levels of the mine, and they literally lived in the mine to haul the carts to the where the lift was, where they could be loaded. And of course, that's an expense. You have to, if you're you're hauling things up from 5,000 feet, that's more expensive than doing it from 1,000 feet, or in Arizona, where they begin to develop open pit mines, where you don't have any haul and lifting costs, and you can minimize your pumping costs.
So would you say this is just the downfall of the world?
Yeah,
the downfall of mines? Sorry, you froze, right?
It's a combination. Their cost of doing business, the cost of doing business is higher than in their competitive markets. And they're also, as they go deeper, the percentage of copper per rock, in the rock, is beginning to shrink. Some people argue that they could be viable if the price had stayed at the World War I level, but the price wasn't going to stay at the World War I level. Once the war is over, the price comes down and they begin to become unprofitable. They have a little bit of a resurgence in World War II, the Second World War.
So they're still up during World War II.
No. Well, most of them have gone to sort of minimal production. What they actually do is they develop a new technology, and they reprocess the waste rock from previous 100 years of production, which had piled up, and using new technology are able to extract a lot of copper from that rock that they had not technically been able to extract earlier. And so it shifts from being they're still called mines, but they're not really mining in the traditional sense. They're reprocessing waste sand, which is pulverized rock. It has a consistency of sort of grainy sand, but it's pulverized rock, and that was part of the process. The rock would be brought up, it would be pulverized, and there's a flotation step, and then the copper that floats to the surface is then smelted into ingots and shipped out. The other thing that happens to them is their copper was chemically different from the rest of the copper in the world. And that became a problem because the major processing centers, geared up to process the most common types of ore. And that actually happens not just to the copper mines. I've done some work on an iron mine that's about 90 miles east of this district. And it had a very, very high quality ore that it could be directly shipped. It had high enough iron content that it could be shipped directly to smelters. Well, the rest of the iron industry shifts to taconite enriched pellets, and and that requires an entirely different set of handling equipment and processes to make it from ore to iron. And so the very, very rich ore simply didn't fit into the system. And so that mine became uneconomical. And so there's a complicated series of things that are happening. And part of it is their operating costs are escalating. The price in the world market is not keeping pace with their costs, and the competition from newer and frankly richer districts. I mean, Butte is a tremendous reserve of copper ore. It's incredibly rich. reserve. Australia, the Australian copper mines are huge, huge masses. Chile, I mean, they just dwarf it in terms of how much copper there is. And so they had an initial advantage in that in the 1840s, they had relatively low operating costs. They had a very high quality product. They could process it.
High demand and action.
Yeah.
So when the mining industry goes out of business, if you will, what happens to the town after
Well,
that?
they shrink tremendously. Calumet, Michigan, which was one of the centers of the mining industry, goes down from several 100,000 people to 30,000 within a few years. There were 6 Catholic churches in Calumet, to service this population. There were probably a dozen or more Lutheran churches, and that the business district, collapses. You can see if you when you go up there, and when you just drive around and you'll see just foundations because people just houses, there was no one to live in them, and they just sat empty. And then with the amount of snow that falls up there, it doesn't take long for the roof to cave in. and so you have this real shrinkage of population and an aging of the population. The population becomes on average quite old because it's so isolated, even with the railroad, when it has the railroad, that very few other industries really come in.
That's the problem with mining towns in general, isn't it? That both people just work and then aren't able to maintain the towns, and then they have to leave and it becomes ghost towns.
Yeah, well, because you can't pick where you want to put it. You have to put it where the mineral is.
Yeah.
And so they tend to be remote. And so
people don't think the long game in this thing. What happens after the mine runs out? What should we do then? People don't think about that sometimes.
Well, there's sometimes, and there have been some efforts. I mean, there's there's a university there in the Copper District that originally was there to train miners and mining engineers, and they've done a lot with developing the forest industry, and lumbering and forest products, and but that's not the kind of industry that creates huge numbers of jobs. Right. There are a number of paper mills, but they were never able to attract anything that would create the number of jobs, that the mines offered. And so all of the communities decline in size. And,
I was watching this Norwegian documentary. I don't know if this is the town we're talking about actually, but it's probably not. But this guy called Thomas Schelzer, he went around America to see what it's really like for those who have it kind of worse, if you will, living condition. And he went to one ex-mining town, and it was one of the poorest towns in the country. People mine shut. It was a coal mine, and they shut down, and then they weren't able to. They didn't know what to do after the mine shut down because they couldn't find work. They had no education other than mining, and they were frustrated because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And the government basically experimented with drugs on this town. I don't know if you know which town I'm referring to. I don't remember.
No, I don't know the specific town, but I know the problem because I'm in Western Kentucky right now. But in Eastern Kentucky, that's exactly what's happened. There were coal mines. You've probably heard of Appalachia.
Yeah.
That there were a huge number of coal mines that were very prosperous and productive from the 1870s into the, maybe into the 1930s. But over time, the demand for coal is not what it used to be as oil and particularly natural gas have come online.
It's the same with copper, I imagine.
Pardon?
It is the same with copper, I can imagine.
Yes, although metals, yeah, they can now, obviously, electrical wiring is not as big as, fiber optic cable is probably more of in demand. But the other thing that's happened and it's happened in all mining, the technology has changed tremendously.
Yeah.
I mean, I went down into a coal mine, maybe 20 years ago, and there were like 6 people working, and they pointed out that and they have a machine now. The machine just like chews the coal right out of it's like just on a belt and it's out. That machine can produce more coal in an hour than 100 men could in an 8-hour shift. So, even if you could bring back coal, you're not going to bring back the jobs.
Yeah.
Because the technology has come along and replaced it.
I need to translate this word because I cannot remember the word of it. But hold on. Yeah, we had this ore mine in not far from where I live actually, and it's kind of it's a decent town now. That it's not like poor or as bad as you think, but they're the same thing. Is the parents and the kids had to go in generation into the ore mine, and when it shut down, well, you know what happened.
Yeah, no, it's a common problem with, as we move, as the economy, the global economy moves, away from the kind of industry that we knew in the 19th and first half of the 20th century, which was much more labor intense. Now things are much more technology intense.
Yeah.
And there just aren't the jobs. And then some of the things, some of the resources have played out. Mines don't work in, there's not an infinite supply of whatever the mineral is in any one site at a certain point.
Have you been to the mine yourself, the mine we were talking about, or have you?
Oh yeah, no, I've been to the mines both in Ireland. I've been to the Allihies mine.
What was your
a number of
experience
times.
like when you was in both in Ireland and in Michigan?
Well, the Irish mines you can't go down in. They're all flooded.
Oh, right.
But they're it's actually a very scenic place. It's the Beara Peninsula is largely undeveloped. There are some stone ruins, the small villages around them, and it's actually not that different. Other than the weather is better than Upper Michigan, in that the Beara Peninsula juts out into the Atlantic Ocean. The Michigan mines are on the Keweenaw Peninsula, which juts out into Lake Superior. They're both hilly, and sort of an uneven terrain, small settlements. The physical locations are actually fairly the same. Now, I have been underground in a couple of copper mines in Michigan that have been made into tourist attractions, for want of a better word. They've been pumped out and developed. I've been 500 feet underground in one mine, and it's an interesting, when you're in the mine, it's not claustrophobic because it's called a stope. The stope is 30 feet high. So you're in this big open space underground, and you can see the veins of the mineral. And it's just the economics were that it couldn't be continued. But that's a newer mine. I've been in actually one of the first mines from the 1850s, which you literally walk down a staircase into the mine.
Yeah, the
first
crouch?
level. Pardon?
Do you have to crouch?
No, it's high enough. I'm 6'2" and I could walk down. No, they would set up scaffolding to cut. They're more than 8. They're higher because they would build scaffolding up to take down the rock as they could. But that one you can see because you have to be careful. You get down and you're on the first level. But where the shaft was about 6 inches below the surface, you can see the water the mine has flooded. And that's what happens when you eventually abandon them. They fill with water. It takes a while, but rock is actually porous, and once you cut into it with a mine shaft or a drift, the shafts are the part that goes down, the drifts are the part that goes laterally. Water seeps out, and it will accumulate, and so as you go, you have costs of pumping. So you're constantly running steam, and they use steam engines in the 19th century for that. So you're constantly, running a steam engine, and later they were electrified. But that was a tough decision. The mining companies, are we closed for good, or are we just closed for a short period of time because the price is down? Do we turn off the pumps? So once you turn off the pumps, the cost of reopening the mine can become quite substantial. If you have to pump out, millions of gallons of water,
It's quite expensive. I think.
And you can't. Some of it you can't. And nowadays, you can't just pump it into a river. A lot of it is contaminated with different chemicals. Like a lot of the iron mines in northern Michigan have arsenic occurring with the iron, and so the water has a high arsenic content, and you can't just pump arsenic, water with a high arsenic content into the local river. So today there's a lot of technical issues in. Even if that these mines, but there's a number of them that have been kept accessible as tourist attractions. At least
there's much more safety rules, and as well.
Oh yeah, no. It's a different industry than it was. Obviously,
it's much more strict than it was before.
Oh yeah, no. There were for most of the period that I've studied, there were no rules. It was unbridled capitalism, and it was very dangerous. I mean, copper mines are not as dangerous as coal mines. Coal mines are the most dangerous because you have the methane gas, and you have to be careful about explosions if you hit a methane pocket. But in the copper mines, there's no gas; it's solid rock. There's no vegetable matter that decomposed, so you don't have the problem with gas. Right. But there are issues. You're still underground with explosives, and that sends rock moving about. There are shafts and drifts, and one of the most common accidents was someone would, in poor lighting conditions, someone would, miscalculate and fall down the shaft and be killed that way.
Yeah.
Or
thank you so much for coming. I think we covered most of what you were wishing to talk about. I hope.
I appreciate it. I know from what you said, it's a little different from most of what you do, but I hope you enjoyed it.
It's something fascinating about the mining industry, so it was most definitely interesting.
Good. It was nice to talk to you and nice to meet you.
And before you go, do you have anything you wish to promote on the social media where people can find you?
Well, I'm on academia.edu. I have a number of my papers that I've given are there, and I'm working on a book on this, but it's not ready to promote. I've published a number of articles in academic journals, and I have a number of papers, and I've put them on academia.edu. And people I'm at Murray State University. If anyone has any questions, it's wmulligan@murraystate.edu, and I'd be happy to correspond with them.
And you can find us on Instagram at well.agedwell. We are also you can find this podcast on Spotify, iTunes, And on Pocket Cast, wherever you can find most podcasts, we're also on YouTube at Well That Aged Well. And I got a big news because right now I'm starting a second podcast where I will interview not just historians, but people from all walks of life. For example, I'm going to interview someone that escaped and grew up in a cult. So that will be very interesting. I already recorded someone who worked for Jim Jeffries show, and we had an episode on conspiracy theories, which you can find exclusive only on stereo. The app is free to download. All you have to do is find us at that aged well, not well in first, it's just that aged well. And I will put it in the description below. So that's definitely check us out. Give us a follow if you will. Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well. This has been Well That Aged Well. Thank you so much for coming. I'll see you next week.
Take care. Thank you very much.